The SS Great Britain has travelled over 1 million miles, taking passengers and cargo all over the world. But your experience as a passenger would be completely determined by your place in society. If you were in steerage, you would be in for a pretty miserable 3 months. And it seems that for some souls aboard this ship, their misery continues to echo through the corridors, long after this iron giant came home. Come sit by me as we get into the, quite frankly, incredible history of this amazing ship, what life would have been like for the passengers, and who may potentially still be roaming the SS Great Britain to this day. So the SS Great Britain, she was the brainchild of one Isambard Kingdom Brunel, who was a civil engineer and I'd say a fairly decent one at that. And that is an absolute understatement. Like, this guy was a workaholic who was completely dedicated to engineering. And he was pretty incredible at it. He was the chief engineer overseeing the Thames Tunnel, which was a massive success. But what he really wanted to achieve, his dream, was a direct line from London to New York. In 1833, he got to create the first leg of that seamless journey as he was appointed by the Great Western Railway to build a train line from London to Bristol. And then you've just got the slight problem with the next leg of the journey. You know, that whole great big Atlantic Ocean in between Bristol and New York. But Brunel wasn't going to let a little thing like 41.1 million square miles of ocean stop him. He was going to be the guy that built a luxury ship that could cross the Atlantic, getting passengers from London straight to New York. He was going to build the SS Great Britain. In 1839, the Great Western Dockyard was built and construction began on what would become the largest ship in the world at that time. She ended up being 320 feet long, weighing almost 3,000 tons. But that wasn't the only thing that the Great Britain would be known for. She was constructed almost entirely out of raw iron, which had never been attempted before. She used a screw propeller, which was utterly unheard of, because these kind of ships at the time, they would have used paddles, which would have been on like either side of the boat, and that had been the original idea that Brunel had sold to the investors. So this caused like a little bit of drama during the construction, as he basically saw another ship with this like screw propeller contraption, the Archimedes, and decided that screw propellers were going to be the way forward. So then he had to convince the investors, who were a bit unsure, to say the least, as they had given him the money on the understanding that they were going to build this ship the way that they had always done before, with like the big old paddles going around. We're going for old reliable, we know our money's safe. But Brunel had other plans, which would turn out to completely change the future of shipping forever, so, I mean, there's that. Aside from her functional innovations, she was, like, properly decked out inside as well. Because she was going to be a transatlantic liner aimed at first and second class passengers, her interior was fitted out to resemble those, like, really high-class hotels that you'd find in London at the time. Like, very fancy. So 4 years later, in 1843, the SS Great Britain is complete and she's ready to be set loose on the big wide world. She was seen out of the dry dock by Prince Albert himself, where she made her way out into the floating harbour. In 1845, she made her first trip to London, where she stayed for 6 months. And that was where Queen Victoria herself even had a walk around, so it was very nice. But a bit later that year, it was time for the real test. She set off from London to Liverpool, ready to pick up the passengers and make her maiden voyage over to New York. So with all of her first and second class cabins, she was set up to hold 360 passengers. The owners of the ship, the Great Western Steamship Company, they had like high hopes for the SS Great Britain. They'd like really done their publicity. Like, I mean, look at her. She's like this huge, great big hulking ship, completely different to anything that existed at the time. And she was complete luxury. Like, she was tailored to these upper class people. They expected to start making bank on her maiden voyage, but it didn't quite work out, as they only sold 45 out of the 360 tickets on offer. So not a great start, like they're starting to sweat a little bit, but the main voyage was a success. She made it to New York in something like just under 2 weeks, and then made it back to Liverpool again, like no problems, it's all great. Other than a couple of teething problems, they were really thinking that they were onto a winner here. So out she went to New York again. However, what they couldn't see was that her propellers, like off the screw propeller, they were coming loose. That you kind of need those to be able to move. So on the return leg of this journey, so on her way back to Liverpool, the propeller blades started to come off. By the time she had limped back home, she only had 1 blade left. The other 5 had been left in like a weird breadcrumb trail all along the Atlantic Ocean. But at least she'd made it back, so they could actually like sort the propeller out and everything was all good again. They were really getting into a groove with the SS Great Britain. She was going back and forth from Liverpool to New York, no problem. Which I thought that the whole plan was so that she could go from London to Bristol on a train and then go to New York. Like, they'd built the train line from London to Bristol, but the ship was leaving from Liverpool. So apparently that was because Bristol wasn't really set up for the size of ship that the SS Great Britain was, so Liverpool made more sense as they already had like a pretty established port. So there she was, happily going back and forth until her 5th voyage. The captain didn't see the lighthouse properly and ran her aground in Northern Ireland, which was an absolute disaster. And like, that was nearly the end of this story. Like, they were just talking about writing her off and scrapping her, just because it would have been too costly to get her back going again. And if anyone other than Brunel had built her, I think that may have been the case. But this guy, he was determined. Like, the Great Britain was a jewel in his crown of a legacy. Does that make sense? I think that makes sense. It might not make sense. The SS Great Britain was very important to him. So he made sure that she was protected over the winter, and then they got to work refloating her in the spring. Yay, right? Apart from the company that actually owned her, the Great Western Steamship Company, went broke during the refloating. Luckily, another company took her on called Gibbs Bright and Company. They refitted her, turning her more into a sailing ship with a more efficient engine for when it was needed, and got her ready for a new life, voyaging back and forth from Australia. So the 21st of August 1852 was her first trip out, carrying 630 passengers. Again, it was a success, so they started making that trip back and forth for 23 years. These owners, they must have been like chortling their way to the bank at this point. Like, they had picked up the Great Britain for £18,000, and now she was going back and forth carrying passengers to Australia for over 2 decades. The return on investment. And those tickets were not cheap. Like, if you were a first class passenger, you would be paying £70 for your ticket, which is like £5,500 in today's money. Like, even the steerage tickets, like the lowest of the low sort of passengers, they were pretty expensive too. Because yeah, during those voyages, they'd like created extra spaces so more of those poor people could get a shot at a new life in Australia. But the steerage ticket would still set you back 15 guineas, which was about 6 months' wages for a skilled worker. In total, she made 32 round trips to Australia, giving so many people the new start that they were looking for. And so when I was reading that, I was getting a bit confused because back then I thought they kind of just used Australia as like a dumping ground for convicts, like when they get sentenced to transportation. So then why would free citizens want to go to this land full of really bad people? But I was educated because yeah, on the outside it does seem kind of weird why people would want to go to Australia of their own free will when there's like rapists and murderers being sent there to the penal colonies as punishment. But basically they found gold in Australia in the 1850s, so everyone is just like getting those dollar signs in their eyes kind of thing. And then I don't know if you're aware of this, but Australia is pretty big. Like it's huge. You could fit 32 United Kingdoms into the continent of Australia. So if you lived in those like overcrowded British cities, you could pretty much guarantee that you were never going to be able to own your own land. You'd probably never be able to leave the city. And what do you know? Australia, we have loads of land and we don't have all these weird land inheritance laws and costs. Like, you can come and start up a ranch if you want. And it gets even better if you're thinking about Australia as your new life. The government will literally pay you to move over there. They'd subsidise like the cost of travel and even pass out like land grants and other forms of support to help you with your new life. It's probably best to just like not ask too many questions to your new neighbour, just on the off chance he didn't have a choice about going in the first place. So the SS Great Britain would have helped these people start their new lives down under, but let's not forget that this is still the 19th century. Everything is still very much determined by your social class and how much money you have. And you're going to have very different experiences aboard the SS Great Britain. So for first class passengers, they had their own designated areas where the riffraff weren't allowed. They had this gorgeous looking promenade deck with like big skylights. It was lovely. And even the cabins for first class, like yeah, they weren't huge, but you still had enough room for a sofa and a wash basin. Whereas steerage, yes, it was unpleasant. Steerage passengers were stuffed down into basically wherever they couldn't put other passengers. So you'd be on the part of the ship where the hull rocked the most, closest to the engine room, where it's like super loud, super hot, and just not nice. You'd be packed in, obviously, so that the company could sell more tickets and make more money, so that would just add to the unpleasantness. Because humans are stinky. And what do you also get on board ships? Rats. Most likely disease-ridden rats. And so what else do you get? That's right, diseases! Illness was obviously super common on the SS Great Britain. Like, you're in close quarters with over 700 people for up to 3 months. Like, you're gonna get ill. So it's unsurprising to know that a few passengers would never make it to their new life in Australia. Typhoid, cholera, and even smallpox were found on the ship at one time or another during these Australia voyages. But it was tuberculosis that was the most common cause of death on the ship, with 16 confirmed kills. And if you don't know, tuberculosis was also known as consumption back then because the disease would look like it's sort of like consuming you from the inside. Like, you would just waste away. It was a horrible, nasty disease that affected your lungs, and it was super contagious. They also had no antibiotics at that time, so they had no way of treating it. So it's not something that you'd want to know that you were travelling alongside with in a confined space for 3 months. But even with the disease, it wasn't an uncommon amount. Like, it was probably more than your average 19th century street, just because of how close together everyone was living. But overall, the Great Britain was seen as quite a hygienic, healthy ship. Especially, obviously, if you were in first class away from the germ bags in steerage. There was also a ship's doctor who provided complimentary healthcare to passengers, and it was kind of included in your ticket price, so it wasn't like the poor were just left to die or whatever. I mean, like, they still paid for tickets, like, that would have been bad for business. In total, there were 140 recorded deaths on board, with crew members obviously suffering more fatalities from accidents instead of illnesses, which again makes sense, like, the crew would have been the ones doing the dangerous jobs on board. There was one story of a crew member called George Green, and he was taking in the upper main topsail during a hurricane. So he's got, like, the wind whipping around him, there's rain and seawater, like, lashing his face, can't even hear himself think, trying to pull this massive ass sail in. Because if he doesn't, the wind could like rip it away or even damage the mast, and then you're in for a world of trouble. But as George was doing this super important job, he lost his footing and fell onto the deck below. He actually landed in one of the lifeboats that were on the deck, but it wasn't enough to break his fall, and he died instantly. There is another story of a crew member's death, although this one is a lot more mysterious. And it's probably the most famous story out of all of them, for reasons we will most definitely get into later. But it's about one of the ship's captains, Captain John Gray. Now, Captain Gray was absolutely beloved on the Great Britain, having worked his way up from the ship's second mate to the first mate, and then on the 20th of April 1854, he took over as the captain. So many passengers talk about him in their diaries and letters, saying he was a warm character, like a father figure, and just an all-round great guy. Like, no one had a bad word to say about him. But it wasn't just his personality that filled the room, he was said to be absolutely huge. He was 6 foot, which back in those days was absolutely gigantic, and weighed something like 17 stone. Which, I don't know, is that about right for being 6 foot? If you're 6 foot and 17 stone, that feels like that would be a normal weight for a 6 foot guy. I'm gonna look into this. Healthy weight for 6 foot man. I don't know pounds. What does that mean? Okay. So he might be carrying a bit of timber, but apparently a healthy weight for a 6 foot guy is 12 stone. Then you look at a photo of him and he looks quite portly. Okay, we'll say that. And so you could apparently hear the captain's hobnail boots getting closer to you before you actually saw him, as his footsteps would just like echo through the ship as he's going about his business. Now, there is some talk online that he was suffering with pain in his like liver and stomach, or it was his kidneys, depending on where you read. But it was apparently recorded in the Tasmanian newspaper that it had been brought about by anxiety, because by then, apparently other ships had started to enter the scene and were directly competing with the Great Britain. And so this stress had caused gut issues in the captain for the last couple of voyages. On the evening of the 25th of November 1872 though, he was apparently complaining of not feeling very well, like his guts were playing him up, and so he retired to his cabin early. But that was the last time anyone ever saw him. The next morning, his cabin was found empty. What was even weirder was the window was wide open, even though it had apparently been screwed shut the night before. There was no trace of Captain Gray anywhere, so it was clear that he must have gone through the window and overboard during the night. Because he had obviously been complaining about these stomach issues and the stress of these competing ships, a lot of people assumed that he'd just thrown himself overboard, but others weren't so sure. Some think that he might have been murdered for the gold that was apparently stashed in his cabin, which it sounds a bit sensational to me, to be honest, but I guess like not out of the realms of possibility. And then other people suspected that it might have just been an accident. Like if he was really feeling as rough as he said, maybe he just opened the window to get some fresh air in and somehow maybe like lost his balance and fell overboard. It's just one of those mysteries that we're never going to be able to figure out. And just to tie off this whole tragic story with just the saddest little bow, just to dig the knife in a little bit more, the SS Great Britain arrived in Liverpool. Waiting at the docks was Mrs. Gray, Captain Gray's wife, and their children. Because back in those days, there was no way to get word out about what had happened until the ship arrived. And so that's how Mrs. Gray and her children found out that Captain Gray had disappeared and was presumed dead on Christmas Day. It's just not what you want, is it? You hate to see it. But with a ship, even nowadays, it is a risk. People will go overboard, just like what apparently happened with a German passenger in 1866. He was noted in other passengers' letters and diaries as a quiet, melancholic man, kind of kept himself to himself, like didn't really engage. But that didn't really work, especially in steerage where this man had been. Like, everyone knows everyone. You spend 3 months holed up with a bunch of people, you get to know everyone's business. But one day, they woke up to the news that he was missing and had presumably thrown himself overboard that night. And because no one really knew who he was, it seems like he wasn't really missed. Like, the diaries were kind of just like, oh yeah, this German guy probably threw himself overboard last night. Today's breakfast was lovely. But for those passengers and crew that died on the ship though, they were still destined to end up in the sea. I mean, space was still at a premium. They weren't just about to be storing bodies until they arrived at their destination. If a passenger or crew member had died, the body would be sewn up in a piece of canvas with some iron lumps so that it would sink. They were then covered with a Union Jack flag, and 6 sailors in their finest uniform would carry the body to the lee gangway, which would have been a passageway that was on the side of the ship that was kind of sheltered from the wind, where they then would have been committed to the sea. Sometimes there were special circumstances when someone died. There was one report of a woman called Mary Cohen, who was sailing to Australia with her new husband after they'd just got married 3 weeks before. She was 19 years old, she was about to embark on this new life with her husband, everything was going amazing, until she developed really aggressive bronchitis. She unfortunately died, but because she was Jewish, they couldn't give her the standard burial at sea. Captain Gray was still around at this time, and just as an example of the type of guy that he was, he kind of went against protocol and allowed the storage of Mrs. Cohen's body until they reached Melbourne, where she was buried in a Jewish cemetery. And I feel like I've just spoken for ages about death, so to somewhat lighten the mood before we carry on, there were 50 babies born on the ship. So there's that. In 1882 though, the SS Great Britain had changed hands again, and with that changed up like what she would be used for. Her engine was removed and she was converted into just like a straight up sailing ship. Because she was absolutely huge, you take out the engine and you've got even more room, so she made the perfect cargo ship. Plus, if you're just using wind instead of powering an engine with coal, it's gonna be cheaper to run. So off she went onto another new job, carrying coal from Wales to San Francisco. And so this route meant passing Cape Horn, which is like right at the bottom of South America and is notorious for being ridiculously rough seas. In 1886, the SS Great Britain was caught in a particularly bad storm near Cape Horn where she was damaged. They managed to kind of like limp her to the Falkland Islands, which is kind of downwind from where the storm was, before they decided what to do with her. The owners and insurers decided that it was just going to cost too much to try and repair her, so they decided to sell her to the Falkland Islands Company as a hulk. She was basically taken around the back and had a bullet put in her. No, that's not what happened. I mean, she was left in Port Stanley, stripped of anything valuable, and used as a hulk to store coal and wool. And here she sat in Port Stanley for 47 years. After this though, her decks were like beginning to leak, so they couldn't even use her as a hulk anymore. So then they really did take her out the back and shoot her. In 1937, she was towed out of Port Stanley and taken around to Sparrow Cove, where she was ran aground and basically just left to rot. She was supposed to rust away, but she didn't. And so even in 1968, she was sat there in Sparrow Cove, slowly decaying. But I mean, what could you do? It's a huge, great big ship. She's been used and abused as a hulk. She had this massive crack in her side that they didn't even know how bad it was because it kind of like went down under the waterline. But she was so sad looking. Like, after the life that she'd lived, like the thousands of passengers that she'd helped along to the next chapter of their lives. Like, to see her sat in Sparrow Cove, alone, just left to the elements, and sometimes the penguins, it was just sad to see. And I'm sure that if Brunel had still been alive, he would have done something about it, just like he'd done before in Northern Ireland. But he'd died in 1859. There were others that had the ambition to bring her home, though. Like, how good would that be? To finish off her story and come full circle, bringing her back to Bristol. But now, I mean, look at her. She's not going anywhere. Like, even if you wanted to get her back to Britain, how was that gonna happen? But there was someone out there with just enough ambition and most likely a touch of madness to attempt it. Ewan Corlett was a naval architect and refused to see the SS Great Britain die so far away from home. In the winter of 1968, the HMS Endurance pulled in, carrying Ewan Corlett and some brainiacs from the Royal Navy to do a survey of the ship and the waters. What do you know? They found that, yeah, It was possible. Theoretically, it could be done. Well, I mean, you get news like that, like it's game on. If they moved quickly and the damage didn't get any worse. Because like at any moment, there could be another huge crack and the entire ship breaks in half. And if that happened, then the whole project would be over before it had even started. But what happened next was just an incredible feat of engineering, like by some very clever and determined and lucky people. They took her masts off, sealed the holes in her hull, and used mattresses to seal that crack in her side. Yeah, mattresses. The thinking was, as the ship was floated, the crack would like come together and squash the mattresses, making it watertight. I don't know, it kind of made sense, but the Navy had been doing this for years, so they obviously knew what they were doing. They managed to refloat the Great Britain, but she wasn't going to be able to sail the 8,000 miles home to Bristol. What they eventually decided to try was basically towing her back home on a pontoon. So the pontoon, like this like platform thingy, was sank in Sparrow Cove, and once the Great Britain was floated, she was kind of manoeuvred very carefully over this pontoon. Once they were perfectly lined up, the pontoon was refloated, bringing the Great Britain out of the water and securely onto the pontoon. I'll say it quickly, it sounds super easy, right? In reality, it was stressful as hell, and I don't think a single person involved in that part of the project took a breath until she was safely secured to the pontoon. But everything went well. The mattresses did the trick, the pontoon floated up perfectly, and the SS Great Britain was ready for the longest towing journey in history. She arrived back in Bristol on the 19th of July 1970 and was eventually manoeuvred back into the Great Western Dockyard, where she was launched 127 years before. Since 1970, the SS Great Britain Trust has been sort of like working to preserve her from further corrosion, and they operate an absolutely fantastic visitor centre, so you can go and literally like walk around the ship yourself and learn all about Brunel, the ship, the voyages, like all of it. And it's so cool to just like go and walk and like see all the different cabins and stuff. It's crazy. But it seems like the ship brought home some extra cargo with her. The Trust was setting about restoring her to her former glory, putting all the decks back where they used to be, fitting out all the cabins and doing all of that so that you could like go and have a wander around. The stories coming out of the ship though are absolutely wild. So there was this one security guard who was doing the rounds after visitors had left for the day, making sure like no one was left over kind of thing, no one was trying to get a sneaky sleepover or whatever. And he was on the promenade deck when all of a sudden one of the cabin doors began to swing wildly back and forth. There was no wind. Obviously the ship is completely secured down. She's not moving with the waves or whatever. There was no explanation. Another security guard witnessed a door handle turn clockwise, thinking that that was very strange, and if it was someone that was locked in there that shouldn't be, they would be making an awful lot more noise than just gently turning a door handle. So he unlocked the locked door to find not a single soul on the other side of it. And it seems like the promenade is one of the most active spots on the whole ship. The figure of a woman is commonly seen in the area, and the medium that was along for the ride on the most haunted episode, he claimed that it was the spirit of Mary Cohen. I don't know, just take that with a pinch of salt, of course. But also in the promenade, there is a piano, which I'm guessing is set up how it would have been back in the day, sort of like providing a bit of entertainment for the first class passengers. But one day, two members of staff both heard piano music playing from the ship. It doesn't say, but I'm guessing that they went and checked out the promenade deck to see that like there definitely was no one playing the piano, which would have explained it. But it didn't say what they did to verify where the music was coming from, so there's that. Someone else that is said to particularly enjoy the promenade in the afterlife is the spirit of Captain John Gray himself. He's apparently been seen all over the ship, but quite often haunts the promenade. He's described as this very large, very angry entity. I mean, he was a large man in life, so that makes sense. But to be angry? That one's a bit weird to speculate on. Like, if he had actually killed himself, why would he come back as angry? Was he angry because someone had murdered him and thrown him out the window? Or was he pissed that he'd accidentally fallen out the window and no one had noticed? Weird one. But, like I said, he was captain of the ship. He would go around the entire place, making sure it was all up to scratch, and it seems like he is still doing that now. In the 1990s, there was a travel and tourism student who was on work placement at the visitor attraction when he was just like having a wander around the ship. Which, can I just say, is an absolutely amazing place to do work experience. I did mine in a play group, like a nursery daycare thing for kids, and ended up catching shingles, so that was a great experience all around. Anyway, he'd reached all the way down into the bowels of the ship, like pretty much as low as you can go, when he noticed a man sitting down there. He apparently had a white shirt on and a grey beard. He just assumed this guy was a workman, although he wasn't quite sure what the guy was doing, so he called out to him. But the workman just sat there, unmoving, staring at this 17-year-old kid. I'm going to assume that the student just like walked away at this point, like, okay, old guy's ignoring me while staring straight at me. I'm just going to go now. He thought it was a bit odd anyway, so he mentioned it to a few of the staff members who said that he may have just encountered the captain himself. When he was shown a photo of Captain Grey, he immediately recognised him as the workman that he had seen down there in the ship. The steerage area seems to be another relatively active spot, which, again, I guess it makes sense. Like, it would have been, let's be honest, a pretty miserable place to be. Like, lots of people would have died in those areas. Apparently, visitors have been overcome with emotion when they enter these areas. There's also apparently the ghost of a small child that is seen in lots of different places in the ship, but is most commonly seen in the steerage area. Elsewhere in the ship, the disembodied cries of a woman have been heard in the corridors, and sometimes the sound of hobnail boots have been reported, walking towards you. But of course, no one appears. Strange, that sounds almost exactly like how Captain Grey was described in life. You'd hear his hobnail boots before anything else. Doors will be heard slamming, but when you go and investigate, those very doors will be locked. Which on the surface sounds very eerie, doesn't it? But I couldn't help but think, like, right, okay, it's a ship. There's a hell of a lot of doors going on there. If you're just hearing the doors slam and you don't actually see which one it was, how can you be sure? I don't know, echoes do weird things in confined spaces, so I'm not 100% convinced on that one. There's also reports of shadowy figures seen walking through walls and locked doors. And the figure of the sailor, George Green, who fell from the rigging, has also apparently been seen roaming the deck. Because while during the day, the SS Great Britain is teeming with life and eager little visitors that want to learn everything they can about this incredible ship, it seems like once it gets a little quieter on board, there may be some otherworldly entities that come out to relive their glory days. So let me know what you think. Is the SS Great Britain haunted by the spirits of those that died on board? Or is it just a creaky old ship and an overactive imagination? Okay, so I do think that there is some energy still there. Like the emotions of people traveling over for their new life in Australia, all these things, the births, the deaths, like it's all gonna leave a mark. Are there any intelligent entities there? That one I'm not 100% sure about. I think that the majority of the activity is just echoes of past events. The one part that does get to me though is the Captain Grey story. Like what happened to that poor guy? Even if he did off himself, like no one deserves that. And again, that's gonna have some pretty big feelings tied to it. So if there were gonna be any intelligent entities on board, his story would make him a great candidate, I suppose. Either way, unless a visitor comes face to face with a ghost on the ship, I doubt there are gonna be any more paranormal stories coming out of the place. From what I could see, there have been like a couple of ghost hunts more than anything, but it seems to be tied with the most haunted experience that you can book onto. And even all of those, they seem to be like a couple of years ago. To me, it kind of seems like the attraction is sort of like moving away, is trying to distance itself from that, I say like potentially like a bit darker side of the history. Like we went there last month when we were passing through Bristol, and I have to say like the quality of the whole attraction, like it is really good. And it's absolutely worth it to go and have a wander just through the ship if you don't do anything else. It is brilliant. But there isn't much emphasis or like mention on the deaths, like the hauntings, like none of that. Which is fair enough, like not everyone wants that sort of tourism, I guess. But yeah, for me, I do think it is haunted, but probably more residual than anything. But please do let me know what you think. If you visited and experienced anything, I want to know all about it. And if you enjoyed this story, why don't you leave it a little like and let me know. And maybe if you'd like to hear another story you'd fancy subscribing to. I don't know, if you fancy it. But that is all from me today. I cannot wait to chat with you more next week. So until next time, sleep safe. And she was converted into just a straight say that fast. A straight Alright, a straight sailing ship.